Good evening, and congratulations, you've chosen boredom on purpose. Tonight we're diving into a life so harsh and lonely that modern people would probably call it cruel and unusual punishment. You're about to spend the next hour learning what it was really like to be a shepherd in the Scottish Highlands during the 1700s, and I'll warn you right now, you probably won't survive this mentally intact. Picture yourself waking up in a stone bothy, barely bigger than a modern bathroom, somewhere high in the mist shrouded mountains of Scotland. The year is 1720, and you've just committed to a life that will test every fiber of your being. The Highland air bites at your face as you emerge from your shelter, and you can already hear the restless bleating of sheep scattered across the hillside. Your boots, if you're lucky enough to own a decent pair, squelch through mud that never seems to fully dry, and the familiar ache in your back reminds you that yesterday's work was just the beginning of another endless cycle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere warm and cozy, drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where in the world people are falling asleep to Scottish sheep stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull yourself from the scratchy wool blanket that serves as your only luxury and immediately feel the cold Highland air seep through the gaps in the stone walls. Your bothy, basically a shepherd's hut, measures maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, with walls built from whatever stones you could gather and mortar made from mudgrass and hope. The roof consists of turf laid over wooden beams, and when it rains heavily, which happens roughly 300 days a year in the Highlands, water drips steadily onto your sleeping area. The historical reality of these shelters was grimmer than most people imagine. Archaeological evidence from surviving Bothies shows that shepherds often shared their cramped quarters with chickens, cats, and whatever small livestock needed protection from predators. You'd wake up not just to the sound of sheep, but to the scurrying of mice who've discovered your meager food supplies, the cooing of a hen who's decided your pillow makes an excellent nesting spot, and occasionally the angry hiss of a wildcat who wandered in during the night looking for those same mice. Your morning routine begins before dawn because sheep don't understand the concept of sleeping in. You roll off your bed, which is essentially a wooden frame with rope stretched across it, covered by whatever rags and animal skins you've managed to collect, and your feet hit a floor that's probably just packed earth, maybe with some flat stones if you've been particularly industrious. The first task is always rekindling your fire, assuming you were smart enough to bank the coals properly the night before. If not, you're looking at the tedious process of striking flint and steel until your fingers are numb and you're questioning every life choice that led you to this moment. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds of this period typically worked alone or in small groups, but the archaeological evidence suggests that most bothies were designed for single occupancy. This means you're facing each day with only sheep for company, which sounds peaceful until you realize that sheep are about as intellectually stimulating as watching grass grow and significantly more likely to wander off cliffs. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of whatever oatmeal or barley you've managed to keep dry mixed with water and maybe some milk if one of your ewes is feeling cooperative. The Highland diet of this period was notoriously monotonous, consisting mainly of oats barley and whatever you could forage or catch. Protein came from the occasional fish, the very occasional piece of mutton from a sheep that didn't survive the winter, and eggs when your chickens felt like cooperating. Fresh vegetables were essentially mythical creatures that existed only in the lowlands and in the fevered dreams of scurvy-ridden shepherds. The social isolation begins the moment you step outside your bothy and realize that the nearest human being might be days away across dangerous terrain. Unlike farmers who lived in communities or even other rural workers who had regular contact with villages, Highland shepherds existed in a bubble of solitude, broken only by the occasional visit from their employer or the dramatic appearance of cattle thieves. You'd go weeks without hearing another human voice, which explains why many shepherds developed the habit of conducting long, complex conversations with their dogs, their sheep, and eventually with the rocks and clouds themselves. The mathematical impossibility of your job becomes apparent the moment you step outside and scan the rolling Highland landscape. Your employer, some Laird sitting comfortably in his stone manor miles away, has given you what seems like a simple task: keep track of his sheep. The problem is, you're responsible for anywhere from 200 to 800 animals scattered across several square miles of terrain that looks like God crumpled up a map and threw it at Scotland. You squint through the morning mist, trying to count white dots against a backdrop of heather bracken and granite outcroppings that seem designed specifically to camouflage sheep. The animals have spread themselves across the landscape with the strategic precision of military tacticians positioning themselves behind rocks, in gullies, and on the far sides of hills where they're completely invisible from your vantage point. You start counting one sheep grazing near that distinctive boulder, 3 more by the stream, a cluster of maybe 12 near the rowan trees. But within minutes, you've lost track and have to start over. The Highland landscape works against you in ways that would drive a modern person to therapy. Every hill looks identical from a distance, every valley blends into the next, and the weather changes so rapidly that landmarks you counted on in the morning are completely obscured by fog in the afternoon. You develop a mental map based on rock formations, distinctive trees, and the subtle changes in vegetation that indicate water sources. But sheep have an uncanny ability to find the one spot you haven't memorized and congregate there in large numbers. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds used sophisticated counting systems or relied primarily on visual recognition of individual animals, but the evidence suggests a combination of both methods. You learn to recognize individual sheep by their markings, their behavior patterns, and their tendency to graze in specific areas. That ewe with the torn ear always stays near water sources. The ram with the distinctive black patch on his face leads a small group that prefers the higher elevations. The pregnant ewes cluster together in sheltered areas, moving more slowly than the rest of the flock. But even with these recognition techniques, the basic mathematics of shepherding remain brutal. If you're responsible for 500 sheep spread across 10 square miles of highland terrain, and you can realistically observe maybe a quarter of that area from any given position, you're constantly working with incomplete information. You might spend an entire afternoon searching for 30 missing sheep, only to discover they've wandered back to an area you checked that morning. The frustration of this endless shell game would test the patience of a saint, and most shepherds weren't exactly known for their saintly dispositions. The tools available to you for this impossible task are laughably primitive by modern standards. You carry a long wooden staff, useful for maintaining your balance on steep terrain and occasionally for nudging stubborn sheep in the right direction. Your dog, if you're fortunate enough to have one that hasn't been killed by wolves or stolen by raiders, represents your most valuable asset, worth more than your entire annual salary. A good sheepdog could track and herd animals across distances that would take you hours to cover on foot, but training such a dog required years of patience and expertise that many shepherds simply didn't possess. The seasonal movements of your flock add another layer of complexity to the counting problem. Highland sheep in the 1700s practiced a form of transhumance, moving between lower winter grounds and higher summer pastures, following routes that had been established for centuries. During these migrations, you're not just responsible for keeping track of your animals, but for ensuring they follow the traditional paths and don't stray onto lands belonging to other clans or lairds. Property disputes in the Highlands were often settled with swords rather than lawyers, and a shepherd who let his flock graze on the wrong hillside might find himself explaining the situation to armed men with very short tempers. The record-keeping system you're expected to maintain would challenge a modern accountant. Your laird wants to know exactly how many sheep you're managing, how many lambs are born each season, how many animals are lost to predators or disease, and how the overall condition of the flock compares to previous years. You're keeping these records in your head because paper is expensive and literacy is rare among Highland shepherds. Some shepherds developed elaborate systems of knots in rope or notches in wood to track numbers, but these methods were prone to error and easily lost or damaged. The psychological toll of constantly losing and finding sheep becomes part of your daily existence. You wake up each morning knowing that some animals have probably wandered off during the night, that others might have fallen into streams or gotten trapped in bog, and that predators have almost certainly claimed a few more. This creates a baseline level of anxiety that modern people would find unbearable. Every evening involves a frantic attempt to locate missing animals before darkness makes the search impossible, and every morning begins with the discovery of new problems that somehow emerged overnight. Weather compounds the counting problem in ways that would make a meteorologist weep. Highland fog can roll in within minutes, reducing visibility to just a few feet and making it impossible to locate animals that were clearly visible moments before. Rain turns the landscape into a muddy nightmare where sheep tracks disappear and every stream becomes a potential barrier. Snow creates its own special challenges, burying familiar landmarks and making it nearly impossible to distinguish sheep from rox bushes or patches of remaining snow. Yet somehow, generation after generation of Highland shepherds manage to maintain their flocks and satisfy their employers' demands. The secret lay not in perfect record keeping or modern efficiency, but in developing an almost supernatural sense of animal behavior and landscape awareness that took decades to master. The feudal system that governs your life as a Highland shepherd makes medieval serfdom look like a generous employment package. Your Laird, let's call him Lord McSomething or other, owns everything you can see from your Bothie, and several things you can't, including the sheep you tend, the ground you sleep on, and arguably your soul for the durations of your contract. He lives in a stone tower house with glass windows, a proper fireplace, and servants who bring him meals. He didn't have to catch or forage himself, while you exist in conditions that would make a medieval peasant file a complaint with his local guilds. The economic relationship between you and your employer operates on principles that would baffle modern labor negotiators. You don't receive a traditional salary. Instead, you're paid partly in kind, a few sheep of your own, some oatmeal, maybe a small plot of land where you can grow vegetables if you're not too exhausted from chasing livestock around the Highlands. The monetary portion of your compensation amounts to perhaps £5 per year, which sounds reasonable until you realize that a single pair of decent boots costs nearly £2, and you'll wear through at least one pair per season trudging across rocky Highland terrain. Your Laird's understanding of shepherding comes primarily from romantic ballads and conversations with other landowners who've never spent a night in a Bothie. He imagines you leading your flock through peaceful meadows while playing a flute, occasionally composing poetry about the beauty of nature. The reality that you spend most of your time frantically searching for missing animals, treating diseases with folk remedies that may or may not work, and fighting off predators with improvised weapons doesn't align with his pastoral fantasies. The seasonal visits from your employer or his representatives provide some of the most stressful moments of your shepherding career. These inspections typically occur at the worst possible times during lambing season, when half your ewes are having complications, during the summer migration when animals are scattered across 20 square miles, or in the depths of winter when you've just lost a dozen sheep to wolves and are wondering if you'll survive until spring yourself. The inspector arrives on horseback, dressed in clean clothes and carrying expensive equipment to evaluate your performance based on criteria that bear no resemblance to the actual challenges you face daily. Historians still argue whether Highland lairds of this period genuinely misunderstood the difficulties of shepherding or simply didn't care, but contemporary records suggest a combination of both factors. Many landowners kept detailed financial records that reveal their expectations. They wanted their flocks to grow by specific percentages each year, lamb mortality to remain below certain thresholds, and wool production to meet targets that assumed perfect weather and no predation losses. When you fail to meet these impossible standards, the fault is assumed to be yours, rather than the inherent challenges of managing livestock in one of Europe's most hostile environments. The social hierarchy that governs your interactions with your employer is as rigid as it is humiliating. You're expected to remove your bonnet if you own one when speaking to the Laird or his representatives, to address them using titles that acknowledge their superiority, and to accept criticism of your work without offering explanations or excuses. The fact that you possess practical knowledge about animal husbandry and Highland survival that far exceeds theirs is irrelevant. Their ownership of land and title automatically makes them the experts in any conversation. Your contractual obligations extend far beyond simple animal care. You're responsible for maintaining boundary markers, reporting poachers or cattle thieves, providing labor during harvest seasons at your employer's other properties, and serving as an informal intelligence network regarding the activities of neighboring clans. These additional duties mean that even during your supposedly free time, you're still working for your laird in some capacity. The concept of personal time or leisure simply doesn't exist in your world. The most galling aspect of your employment relationship involves the risk distribution. When sheep die from disease predation or accidents, you bear part of the financial responsibility, even though these losses are often completely beyond your control. When market prices for wool or mutton drop, your compensation decreases accordingly. When political conflicts disrupt trade routes or cause raids that scatter your flock, you're expected to restore order without additional support or resources. Meanwhile, when sheep prices rise or your flock produces exceptional wool, the profits flow directly to your employer with little benefit to you. The primitive communication systems of the 1700s Highland mean that misunderstandings between you and your employer can persist for months. Instructions delivered through intermediaries get garbled. Seasonal reports you send rarely reach their intended recipient in accurate form, and requests for additional supplies or support often disappear entirely into the administrative void of Highland bureaucracy. You might spend an entire winter rationing food because a message requesting additional supplies never made it past the Laird's steward, who decided that shepherds complaining about hunger were probably just trying to secure extra rations they could sell for profit. Your employer's other business interests frequently conflict with optimal sheep management in ways that create impossible situations for you. If he decides to lease grazing rights on traditional sheep pastures to cattle drovers, you must find alternative grazing areas without any reduction in your flock maintenance responsibilities. If political alliances require him to grant hunting rights to neighboring clans, you're expected to protect sheep from both legitimate hunters and poachers without any clear guidance about who belongs in which category. The psychological toll of working for someone who fundamentally misunderstands your job while holding complete power over your livelihood creates a constant state of low-level anxiety that would challenge modern stress management techniques. You develop elaborate strategies for managing your employer's expectations while dealing with the reality of Highland shepherding, including the fine art of presenting problems in ways that don't trigger blame and timing your reports to coincide with your laird's better moods. The Highland weather system operates like a malevolent deity specifically designed to torment shepherds, changing moods faster than a Highland chieftain deciding which clan to betray this week. You wake up to what appears to be a clear morning with visibility stretching for miles across the purple heather, and by the time you've finished your meager breakfast of oatmeal and regret, a wall of fog has rolled in from the Atlantic, reducing your world to a gray bubble extending maybe 20 feet in any direction. This isn't the gentle mist of romantic poetry. This is a thick, penetrating wetness that soaks through every layer of clothing you own and makes finding your own sheep feel like a supernatural challenge. The meteorological reality of 18th century Scotland was significantly harsher than the modern climate, as you're living during what historians call the Little Ice Age. Winters lasted longer, summers arrived later and departed earlier, and the growing seasons were shorter and less predictable than they would become in later centuries. Your sheep, hardy as they are still, need adequate grazing time to build up fat reserves for winter, but the weather seems determined to compress the entire growing season into about 6 weeks of decent conditions scattered randomly across what should be spring and summer. Highland rain doesn't fall, it attacks. Unlike the gentle showers that water lowland gardens, Highland precipitation arrives in sheets that strike horizontally, driven by winds that seem to originate from the North Pole and gain malevolence as they sweep across the Atlantic. Your wool cloak, which provides decent protection against normal moisture, becomes a soggy burden that weighs twice as much when wet and takes days to dry in the Highland humidity. The rain finds every gap in your clothing, every imperfection in your Bothies roof, and every weakness in your carefully constructed defenses against the elements. The wind patterns in the Highlands would challenge modern meteorologists, shifting direction without warning and creating localized weather systems that can vary dramatically within the span of a single valley. You might be struggling against a gale that's driving sleet into your face while trying to round up scattered sheep, only to climb over a ridge and find yourself in relatively calm conditions with actual sunshine. This unpredictability makes planning impossible. You can't predict which areas will be sheltered, which pastures will be accessible, or even which direction you should drive your flock to escape an approaching storm. Snow in the Highlands arrives early, stays late, and brings challenges that would defeat modern outdoor enthusiasts equipped with high-tech gear. Highland snow doesn't fall in the picturesque manner of Christmas cards. It arrives in blizzards that can dump several feet of accumulation overnight, burying familiar landmarks and creating drifts that hide streams, bog holes, and cliff edges. Your sheep, despite their thick coats, can become trapped in snowdrifts and freeze to death within hours. Finding buried animals becomes a desperate game of following faint tracks that may lead to live sheep or may simply end at a snow-covered corpse. The temperature swings you experience would humble modern weather forecasters. A day that begins with frost, thick enough to crunch under your feet, can shift to uncomfortably warm conditions by midday, then plunge back toward freezing by evening. These rapid changes stress your animals, affect their feeding patterns, and make it nearly impossible to dress appropriately for outdoor work. You learn to layer clothing in ways that allow for quick adjustments, but even this strategy fails when the weather changes faster than you can add or remove garments. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds of this period had any reliable methods for predicting weather changes, but folklore and surviving records suggest a combination of natural observation and folk wisdom that was surprisingly accurate. You learn to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior for clues about approaching weather systems. When your sheep cluster together and face away from a particular direction, a storm is coming from that quarter. When birds fly low and erratically, the barometric pressure is dropping. When your joints ache more than usual, cold weather is approaching. The seasonal weather patterns create a cycle of challenges that would test the endurance of Arctic explorers. Spring brings flooding as Highland streams, swollen with snowmelt, and seasonal rains burst their banks and turn familiar valleys into temporary lakes. Summer offers the blessed relief of warmer temperatures, but also brings biting insects and clouds thick enough to drive both you and your sheep to distraction. Autumn arrives with deceptive beauty that masks the approaching trials of winter, and winter itself becomes a test of survival that eliminates the weak, the unlucky, and the poorly prepared. Fog represents perhaps your greatest weather related enemy because it transforms familiar terrain into an alien landscape where navigation becomes guesswork and finding scattered sheep becomes nearly impossible. Highland fog can persist for days, creating a gray twilight world where distances become impossible to judge and sounds carry in confusing ways. You develop techniques for moving through fog, following streams using your staff to probe ahead for obstacles, listening for the bells you've hopefully remembered to attach to some of your sheep, but these methods are slow and unreliable. The psychological impact of constant weather-related stress creates a baseline level of anxiety that modern people would find unbearable. You go to sleep each night, wondering what meteorological assault awaits you in the morning, and you wake up scanning the sky for signs of approaching disasters. Every clear day feels like a temporary reprieve rather than normal weather, and every storm feels like a personal attack from forces beyond your control. Your Bothie provides minimal protection against Highland weather extremes, becoming uncomfortably hot during rare warm spells and offering only marginally better conditions than the outdoors during winter storms. The turf roof leaks the stone walls conduct cold efficiently, and the single small window, if you're fortunate enough to have one, provides insufficient light during the extended darkness of Highland winters. The first time you hear wolves howling in the Highland darkness, your blood transforms into something resembling ice water, and every primitive instinct inherited from your cave-dwelling ancestors starts screaming advice about finding a very deep hole to hide in. Scotland's wolves in the 1720s aren't the majestic creatures of modern wildlife documentaries. They're desperate, hungry predators living in an increasingly human-dominated landscape, and your sheep represent the easiest meal they're likely to encounter. The last confirmed wolf kill in Scotland won't occur until later in the century, which means you're dealing with some of the final survivors of a species that's been systematically hunted and poisoned for generations. Your arsenal for defending against these apex predators would make modern animal control officers laugh until they cried. You carry a wooden staff that might discourage a particularly timid wolf, a knife that's more useful for cutting rope than fighting wild animals, and occasionally a crude spear that you fashioned from a long stick and whatever metal you could scavenge or afford. Some shepherds carry ancient firearms, matchlock muskets, that take several minutes to reload, assuming the powder stays dry and the mechanism doesn't jam, but these weapons are expensive, unreliable, and largely useless against fast-moving predators in poor visibility. The hunting behavior of Highland wolves creates challenges that would stump modern wildlife biologists. These aren't pack hunters operating with the coordinated efficiency you see in nature documentaries. They're often desperate individual animals or small family groups driven to prey on livestock because their traditional food sources have been eliminated by human expansion. A single wolf can scatter an entire flock of sheep, not necessarily because it intends to kill large numbers of animals, but because panicked sheep flee in every direction and often injure themselves, falling from cliffs or getting trapped in bog. Cattle thieves, known locally as reavers, represent an even more immediate threat than wolves because they possess human intelligence, sophisticated planning abilities, and weapons significantly better than your shepherd's staff. Highland cattle raiding in the 1700s was practically a professional occupation with organized gangs that could move stolen livestock across clan boundaries faster than news of the theft could travel. These thieves don't just steal a few animals for immediate consumption. They're running sophisticated rustling operations that can deprive you of months or years of work in a single night. The social dynamics of dealing with cattle thieves create impossible situations for Highland shepherds. If the thieves belong to a clan that's currently allied with your employer, reporting the theft might create political complications that your laird would prefer to avoid. If they're from a rival clan, your report might trigger retaliatory raids that put you directly in the line of fire. If they're from your own clan, reporting them might make you a traitor to kinship bonds that supersede employment relationships. You learn to navigate these political waters carefully, sometimes accepting livestock losses rather than triggering conflicts that could escalate into clan warfare. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds were expected to fight off armed raiders or simply report thefts after they occurred, but surviving records suggest that the reality varied depending on the shepherd's personal courage, available weapons, and assessment of the thieves' likely response to resistance. Some shepherds developed reputations as fierce defenders of their flocks and were left alone by all but the most desperate thieves. Others adopted a policy of passive resistance, focusing on hiding their best animals and accepting that some losses were inevitable. Wild men individuals who'd fled civilization due to debt, crime, or mental illness represent perhaps the most unpredictable threat in your Highland environment. These aren't romantic hermits living in harmony with nature. They're desperate people who've been driven beyond the edges of Highland society and now survive by whatever means necessary. Some are harmless madmen who talk to rocks and eat berries, but others are dangerous criminals who view isolated shepherds as easy targets for robbery, violence, or worse. Your sheepdog, if you're fortunate enough to possess one, serves as an early warning system for approaching threats, but also represents a valuable target for thieves who understand that a good working dog is worth more than several sheep. Dog theft was a serious crime in Highland communities, not just because of the animal's monetary value, but because losing a trained sheepdog could effectively end a shepherd's career. You develop techniques for protecting your dog, keeping it close during dangerous periods, teaching it to hide on command, avoiding areas where dog thieves are known to operate. But these precautions can interfere with the animal's shepherding duties. The seasonal patterns of predation and theft follow rhythms that you learn to anticipate, but never fully prepare for. Wolves become more aggressive during winter months when natural prey becomes scarce, leading to increased attacks on livestock during the period when you're least able to defend your flock. Cattle thieves prefer autumn raids when animals are in peak condition after summer grazing, but before winter, weather makes long-distance travel difficult. Spring brings desperate, hungry predators emerging from winter, and summer offers the best visibility for both defending your flock and spotting approaching threats. Your response to predator attacks must balance immediate animal welfare against long-term flock security. Chasing off a wolf might save one sheep, but scatter the rest of your flock across several square miles of highland terrain. Fighting off cattle thieves might prevent immediate losses, but mark you as a target for future retaliation. You develop strategies for minimizing exposure, keeping your most valuable animals closer to your bothy, using natural terrain features for defensive positions, creating noisemakers that can alert you to approaching threats. But these techniques are only partially effective against determined predators. The psychological toll of constant vigilance against multiple types of threats creates a baseline paranoia that modern people would find exhausting. Every unusual sound at night might indicate approaching wolves, cattle thieves, or wild men. Every stranger you encounter might be scouting your flock for future theft. Every day you spend away from your bothy increases the chances that you'll return to find your animals scattered, stolen, or killed. The silence of the Highland wilderness isn't the peaceful quiet that city dwellers imagine when they fantasize about escaping modern life. It's a crushing, oppressive absence of human contact that slowly erodes your grip on sanity like water wearing away stone. You wake up each morning knowing that you might not hear another human voice for weeks, possibly months, and that the only conversations available to you involve sheep, your dog, if you have one, and eventually the rock's clouds and imaginary companions that your increasingly desperate mind conjures up to fill the void left by genuine human interaction. Your social circle consists entirely of animals that view you as either a food source or a mild annoyance depending on their current needs. Sheep possess roughly the same conversational abilities as particularly dim rocks, responding to your attempts at communication with blank stares and the occasional bleat that might indicate hunger fear or simple acknowledgement of your existence. Your sheepdog, if you're fortunate enough to have one, provides the closest thing to companionship available in your isolated world, but even the most intelligent dog can't discuss philosophy, share memories, or provide the complex social interaction that human beings require to maintain psychological stability. The highland landscape itself becomes your primary companion, and you develop relationships with geographical features that would concern modern mental health professionals. That distinctive rock formation becomes Old Malcolm because its silhouette reminds you of your grandfather's profile. The rowan tree near the stream becomes Mary because its graceful branches sway in the wind like a woman dancing. You begin having extended conversations with these natural landmarks, updating them on your daily activities, asking their advice about weather patterns, and sometimes arguing with them about decisions you're struggling to make. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds of this period experienced higher rates of mental illness than other rural workers, but contemporary accounts suggest that isolation-induced psychological problems were common enough to be recognized and named. Shepherd's madness was a known condition characterized by talking to inanimate objects, developing elaborate fantasy relationships, and occasionally losing the ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. Some shepherds would arrive at seasonal markets, speaking to invisible companions, or conducting animated conversations with their staffs. The absence of regular human contact affects your communication skills in ways that become apparent during your rare interactions with other people. You lose the ability to modulate your voice appropriately, either speaking too quietly because you're accustomed to the silence, or too loudly because you've been shouting at sheep across vast distances. Your conversational skills atrophy from disuse, leaving you struggling to follow complex discussions or contribute meaningfully to group conversations. Social cues become mysterious signals that you've forgotten how to read or respond to appropriately. Your relationship with time becomes increasingly fluid as the days blend together without the social markers that help most people distinguish one day from another. Without church bells, market days, or regular contact with other people, you begin measuring time by natural phenomena, the phase of the moon, the behavior of migrating birds, the subtle changes in daylight duration. Some shepherds lose track of days entirely, arriving at scheduled meetings weeks early or late because their internal calendars have drifted away from social reality. The seasonal variations in daylight create additional psychological challenges that compound your isolation problems. Highland winters offer perhaps 4 hours of weak sunlight per day, leaving you to spend most of your waking hours in darkness or gray twilight that saps energy and motivation. The extended darkness affects your sleep patterns, your appetite, and your ability to maintain regular routines. Some shepherds develop what modern medicine would recognize as seasonal affective disorder, becoming increasingly depressed and lethargic as winter progresses. Your mental strategies for coping with isolation evolve from simple techniques to elaborate psychological constructions that help maintain sanity but might alarm outside observers. You develop detailed backstories for your sheep, assigning them personalities, family relationships, and complex social hierarchies that exist only in your imagination. You create elaborate rituals around daily activities, specific ways of preparing meals, checking on animals, or organizing your Bothie that provide structure and meaning to days that might otherwise feel pointless. The religious practices available to isolated Highland shepherds provide some psychological relief, but also create additional challenges. You might go months without seeing a minister or participating in formal religious services, leaving you to maintain your spiritual life through private prayer meditation and the folk religious practices that flourish in isolated communities. Some shepherds develop intensely personal relationships with God the saints or supernatural entities that they believe inhabit the Highland landscape. But these relationships can become problematic when they begin influencing practical decisions about animal care or personal safety. Your physical appearance deteriorates in ways that reflect your psychological isolation. Without mirrors, regular bathing opportunities, or social pressure to maintain grooming standards, you begin to resemble the wild men you occasionally encounter in remote Highland areas. Your hair grows long and unkempt, your beard becomes a tangled mass, and your clothing degrades until you look more like a refugee from civilization than a professional shepherd. When you do encounter other people, their shocked reactions to your appearance remind you how far you've drifted from normal social standards. The development of what psychologists would now recognize as parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connections with entities that can't reciprocate, becomes crucial for maintaining mental health in your isolated environment. You form attachments to particular sheep, specific landscape features, or even weather patterns that provide emotional continuity and meaning. These relationships aren't quite healthy by modern psychological standards, but they're often the difference between maintaining basic sanity and sliding into complete mental breakdown. Your coping mechanisms include elaborate fantasy scenarios where you imagine conversations with family members, friends from your past, or entirely fictional characters who visit your Bothie for extended discussions about philosophy, local gossip, or practical matters. These imaginary interactions can become so vivid and regular that you begin preparing extra food for your invisible guests or setting aside space in your shelter for companions who exist only in your increasingly creative mind. The ancient drove roads that crisscross the Highland landscape, like the arteries of some massive stone-hearted creature, become your highways twice each year when you must guide your flock between winter and summer grazing areas across terrain that seems designed specifically to kill sheep shepherds and anyone foolish enough to attempt this journey without supernatural guidance. These migrations aren't leisurely strolls through picturesque countryside, they're desperate races against weather predators and the simple mathematics of how long your animals can survive without adequate food and water while traversing some of Scotland's most hostile terrain. The timing of these seasonal movements operates on a schedule dictated by forces completely beyond your control. The retreat of winter snow from high pastures, the growth patterns of highland grasses, and the complex political arrangements between various clan territories that determine which routes you're allowed to use without triggering armed conflicts. You can't simply decide that this week looks good for moving sheep. You must coordinate with other shepherds, negotiate passage rights through territories controlled by different lairds, and hope that the weather cooperates with plans made weeks or months in advance. Your summer migration begins sometime between late April and early June, depending on conditions that change annually and can't be predicted with any accuracy. The high summer pastures called sheelings in the Highland tradition offer superior grazing that allows your animals to build up the fat reserves they'll need to survive the following winter. But reaching these elevated meadows requires driving your flock through mountain passes that would challenge modern hikers equipped with GPS and emergency communication devices. Some of these passes remain snow-covered well into summer, creating treacherous conditions where a single misstep can send sheep tumbling down rocky slopes to their deaths. The drove roads themselves represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about Highland geography, but they're not roads in any modern sense. They're simply the least terrible routes between seasonal grazing areas, marked by occasional cairns, worn smooth by countless hooves, and maintained by the collective experience of generations of shepherds who learned through trial and error which paths were passable and which were death traps. Following these routes requires navigation skills that combine practical geography with folk wisdom passed down through oral tradition. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds used sophisticated astronomical navigation techniques or relied primarily on landscape knowledge and traditional route markers. But surviving accounts suggest that the most successful shepherds combined both approaches. You learn to read the stars for general direction, but you also memorize the subtle landscape features that indicate safe passage, the shape of distant mountains, the vegetation patterns that reveal water sources, the rock formations that mark traditional resting spots where generations of shepherds have sheltered their flocks. The logistical challenges of moving hundreds of animals across dozens of miles of difficult terrain would overwhelm modern event planners armed with computers and communication equipment. Your sheep don't understand the concept of staying together, following predetermined routes, or moving at speeds that accommodate the needs of the entire flock. They scatter at the first sign of danger, refuse to cross streams that look perfectly safe, panic when confronted with narrow mountain passes, and generally behave like several hundred individual animals with completely different priorities rather than a cohesive group with shared objectives. River crossings represent some of the most dangerous and frustrating aspects of Highland migrations because Highland streams can transform from gentle brooks to raging torrents within hours of heavy rainfall. A crossing that was perfectly safe when you scouted it yesterday might be completely impassable today, forcing you to detour miles out of your way to find alternative routes. Sheep, despite being reasonably strong, swimmers have an instinctive fear of moving water that makes them reluctant to enter streams even when crossing is clearly necessary for survival. Your role during these migrations evolves from shepherd to military commander, logistics coordinator, and crisis management specialist, often simultaneously. You must maintain awareness of your animal's locations across several miles of terrain, anticipate and respond to threats ranging from predators to sudden weather changes, navigate using landmarks that may be obscured by fog or altered by seasonal changes, and make split-second decisions that determine whether your flock reaches its destination safely or suffers catastrophic losses. The mountain passes that form crucial links in Highland migration routes create bottlenecks where disasters can unfold with terrifying speed. These narrow corridors, carved by glaciers and modified by centuries of erosion, often provide the only practical routes between valleys, but they're also places where a single panicked sheep can trigger a stampede that scatters your entire flock across dangerous terrain. Some passes are so narrow that animals must move single file, creating traffic jams that can last for hours when multiple flocks converge on the same route. Weather conditions during migration periods can shift from favorable to life-threatening within the span of a few hours, leaving you with impossible choices between pushing forward through dangerous conditions or seeking shelter in areas that may not provide adequate protection. Highland storms during migration season combine the worst elements of rain, wind, and temperature drops, creating conditions that can kill exposed animals through hypothermia even when they're not directly injured by the weather. Your winter migration, typically occurring between September and November, involves different challenges but equal dangers as you guide your flock from high summer pastures back to lower elevations where they can survive the harsh Highland winter. This journey often takes place under deteriorating weather conditions with shorter daylight hours and the constant threat of early snowstorms that can trap your animals in high altitude areas where survival becomes impossible. The traditional stopping points along migration routes, ancient shelters, natural caves, and traditional camping areas used by generations of shepherds provide crucial rest stops during these journeys. But they're also points of vulnerability where your flock becomes concentrated and easier targets for predators or thieves. You must balance the need for rest against the security risks of predictable locations, often making difficult decisions about whether to push your tired animals further or risk overnight stops in exposed positions. Your transformation into a makeshift veterinarian begins the first morning you discover one of your ewes lying on her side, breathing rapidly and showing symptoms that you can't identify, but know instinctively mean trouble. Highland sheep in the 1700s face a catalog of diseases, parasites, and medical emergencies that would challenge modern veterinarians equipped with antibiotics, surgical instruments, and decades of formal training. But you're armed with nothing more than folk remedies passed down through generations of shepherds, a basic understanding of animal anatomy gleaned through unfortunate experience and prayers to whatever saint specializes in livestock emergencies. The diagnostic process available to you resembles a primitive form of detective work combined with educated guesswork and the kind of intuitive animal knowledge that develops after years of close observation. You learn to read subtle changes in behavior, appetite, and movement patterns that indicate developing health problems before they become life-threatening crises. That ewe who's been grazing slightly apart from the rest of the flock might be showing early signs of parasitic infection. The ram who's been moving more slowly than usual could be developing foot rot. The lamb that's been bleeding more frequently than normal might be suffering from digestive problems that require immediate intervention. Your medical toolkit consists of items that would make modern veterinarians weep with frustration: a sharp knife for basic surgery, some rope for restraining patients, whatever herbs and plants you can identify and harvest from the Highland landscape, and perhaps some whiskey for sterilizing wounds, assuming you can resist the temptation to use it for sterilizing yourself instead. Some shepherds carry more sophisticated equipment, like primitive forceps made from bent metal or crude needles for suturing, but these tools are expensive, difficult to maintain, and require skills that most shepherds acquire only through painful trial and error. The most common health problems affecting Highland sheep create ongoing challenges that consume significant portions of your time and mental energy. Foot rot caused by bacteria that thrive in the wet Highland climate can cripple entire flocks if not treated aggressively. Your treatment options include trimming away infected tissue with your knife, without anesthesia obviously, and applying various folk remedies ranging from heated tar to infusions of local plants that may or may not possess actual antiseptic properties. The success rate of these treatments depends largely on catching the infection early and on the individual animal's constitution. Parasitic infections represent perhaps your most persistent medical challenge because Highland sheep serve as hosts for an impressive variety of internal and external parasites that can slowly weaken animals until they become vulnerable to other diseases or predators. Your anti-parasitic arsenal consists mainly of herbal treatments that previous generations of shepherds swore by, but that modern science would classify as largely ineffective. Some shepherds develop sophisticated knowledge of local plants that possess genuine anti-parasitic properties, but distinguishing between effective folk medicine and useless superstition requires experience that many shepherds acquire too late to save their animals. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds of this period had access to any genuinely effective medical treatments, or whether their success in maintaining flocks depended primarily on luck and natural selection. But surviving records suggest that the most successful shepherds combined practical medical knowledge with careful observation and preventive care. You learn to recognize the early warning signs of common diseases, to identify environmental conditions that promote health problems, and to implement basic hygiene measures that reduce disease transmission within your flock. The birthing season transforms you into an emergency obstetrician dealing with complications that can mean the difference between successful reproduction and catastrophic losses that threaten your employment and your animal's survival. Highland ewes give birth under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals outdoors, often during bad weather without sterile environments or medical supervision. Your role during difficult births involves physically assisting animals through labor complications, performing emergency procedures with improvised instruments, and making life or death decisions based on limited information and enormous time pressure. Emergency surgery represents the most terrifying aspect of your veterinary responsibilities because Highland sheep encounter injuries that require immediate intervention if the animals are to survive. Wounds from predator attacks, injuries from falls or accidents, and various medical emergencies that develop suddenly all require surgical responses that you must perform with primitive tools under less than ideal conditions. Your surgical experience comes entirely from necessity rather than training, and your success rate depends on luck, determination, and the remarkable resilience of Highland sheep. The psychological aspects of animal medicine create emotional challenges that would test modern veterinarians working in well-equipped clinics. You develop personal relationships with individual animals over months or years, then face situations where you must make pragmatic decisions about treatment costs, survival probabilities, and resource allocation that prioritize the welfare of the entire flock over individual animals. Sometimes this means performing euthanasia with whatever tools are available. Sometimes it means allowing sick animals to die naturally, rather than expending resources on hopeless cases. Your pharmaceutical resources consist entirely of substances you can identify, harvest, and prepare from the Highland environment, plus whatever traditional remedies you've learned from other shepherds or inherited from family members. Some of these folk medicines possess genuine therapeutic properties that modern pharmacology has validated, but others are based on superstition, wishful thinking, or simple desperation. Distinguishing between effective treatments and useless folklore requires careful observation and record keeping that many shepherds lack the time or literacy skills to maintain. The seasonal patterns of disease and injury create predictable cycles of veterinary crises that you learn to anticipate but can never fully prepare for. Spring brings birthing complications and the emergence of parasites that have overwintered in your animals. Summer offers relief from some cold weather diseases, but introduces different parasites and the increased risk of injuries during migrations. Autumn brings the stress of seasonal movements and the need to ensure that your animals are in optimal condition for winter survival. Winter itself becomes a test of your entire flock's health as marginal animals succumb to cold hunger and the accumulated effects of untreated medical problems. Your success as a Highland shepherd depends largely on your ability to maintain the overall health of your flock using nothing more than folk medicine, careful observation, and the kind of intuitive understanding of animal behavior that develops only through years of close contact with livestock under challenging conditions. The Highland market system operates like a complex web of ancient traditions, clan politics, and economic relationships that would baffle modern business analysts. But understanding this system determines whether you earn enough to survive another year or find yourself destitute and looking for alternative employment that doesn't exist in the remote Highland economy. Your sheep represent months or years of labor investment, but their actual cash value depends on factors completely beyond your control: seasonal weather patterns that affect wool quality, political conflicts that disrupt trade routes, market demand in distant cities you've never seen, and the negotiating skills of middlemen who understand Highland commerce far better than you ever will. The journey to market represents almost as much of an ordeal as your seasonal migrations, because Highland markets aren't conveniently located near your grazing areas. They're established in valley towns that require driving your animals across difficult terrain for days or weeks, often through territories controlled by different clans who may or may not allow passage, depending on current political relationships. You must coordinate with other shepherds to form convoys large enough to discourage raiders, but small enough to find adequate grazing along the route, while timing your departure to arrive at market when conditions are most favorable for selling livestock. Your role as a sheep salesman requires negotiating skills that nobody taught you and market knowledge that you've had to acquire through expensive trial and error. Highland wool buyers are professional traders who understand global textile markets, seasonal price fluctuations, and quality grading systems that determine the difference between profitable sales and financial disasters. They can assess your wool's value with a glance, identify defects that reduce market price, and negotiate purchase agreements that favor buyers over sellers who lack alternative options or detailed market knowledge. The clan political system creates layers of obligation and loyalty that complicate simple commercial transactions in ways that would frustrate modern business people. Your laird may have traditional relationships with specific wool merchants that require you to sell through designated channels, even when better prices are available from competing buyers. Clan alliances and feuds can suddenly make certain markets inaccessible or dangerous, forcing you to accept lower prices from alternative buyers or delay sales until political situations resolve themselves in your favor. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds received fair compensation for their products in the 18th century market system, but surviving account books suggest that the complex chain of middlemen, transport costs, and political obligations often left producers with minimal profits from transactions that generated substantial wealth for merchants and landowners. You might spend a year raising sheep that produce high-quality wool, only to discover that market conditions, transport difficulties, or political complications have reduced your expected income to a fraction of what you needed to break even. The seasonal timing of Highland markets creates artificial scarcity and abundance that affects pricing in ways that benefit merchants more than producers. Most Highland shepherds must sell their wool and surplus animals during the same narrow window of time, flooding markets with similar products and driving down prices through oversupply. Merchants who can afford to store wool and livestock until demand increases often realize profits that far exceed the compensation paid to the shepherds who produced these goods. Your financial literacy, like that of most Highland shepherds, extends mainly to counting sheep and calculating basic arithmetic, leaving you vulnerable to sophisticated accounting practices used by wool merchants and livestock dealers. Complex pricing systems based on weight quality grades and market conditions often result in final payments that differ significantly from initial estimates. But challenging these calculations requires mathematical skills and market knowledge that most shepherds simply don't possess. The credit and debt systems that govern Highland commerce create long-term obligations that can trap shepherds in cycles of economic dependence on merchants and landowners. You might need to borrow money for basic supplies equipment or emergency expenses using future wool sales as collateral for loans that carry interest rates and repayment terms that favor lenders. These arrangements can result in situations where several years of productive work barely cover accumulated debts, leaving you financially worse off than when you started. The Highland cattle trade, though not directly your responsibility as a shepherd, affects your economic situation because it competes for grazing resources, influences local labor markets, and determines the overall prosperity of Highland communities where you conduct business. Cattle droving represents more lucrative employment than shepherding, and successful cattle dealers often become wealthy enough to purchase land and sheep flocks, creating economic competition that affects wages and working conditions for professional shepherds. Your understanding of broader economic trends depends entirely on information gathered during market visits and conversations with other shepherds, merchants, and travelers who may or may not possess accurate knowledge about conditions in distant markets. Changes in fashion preferences, international trade policies, or manufacturing technologies that affect demand for Highland wool often reach you months or years after they've influenced market prices, leaving you to make production decisions based on outdated information. The social aspects of Highland markets provide your primary opportunities for contact with the broader world beyond your isolated shepherding territory. But these interactions also remind you of your relatively low position in Highland society. Successful merchants and prosperous farmers and clan gentry who attend these markets dress better, eat better, and conduct business with confidence that reflects their superior education and economic resources. Your own appearance and social skills, shaped by months of isolation and physical labor, mark you as a rural worker rather than a serious participant in Highland commerce. Your negotiating position in Highland markets suffers from the fundamental problem that you must sell your products, whether market conditions are favorable or not. You can't afford to store wool or maintain surplus animals until prices improve, and you need cash income to purchase basic supplies for the following year. This desperation gives merchants significant advantages in price negotiations because they know that shepherds have few alternatives and limited ability to wait for better market conditions. The transportation costs associated with getting your products to market often consume a significant portion of your potential profits because Highland geography makes efficient transportation nearly impossible, and alternative routes are often controlled by competing interests who charge tolls or fees for passage rights. Winter arrives in the Highlands not as a gentle seasonal transition, but as a conquering army that transforms your already challenging existence into a daily battle for survival against forces that seem specifically designed to eliminate shepherds' sheep and anyone foolish enough to remain in the mountains when sensible people retreat to warmer, safer locations. The Highland winter of the 1700s, during the depths of the Little Ice Age, brings temperatures that would challenge modern outdoor enthusiasts equipped with high-tech gear, and you're facing these conditions with wool clothing, primitive shelter, and food stores that may or may not last until spring decides to make its eventual appearance. The daylight hours shrink to a brief window of gray twilight that provides barely enough illumination for essential tasks before darkness reclaims the landscape for another 15-hour stretch of cold, lonely night. Your daily routine becomes a desperate race against time-cramming animal care, food, preparation, shelter, maintenance, and basic survival tasks into perhaps 4 hours of usable daylight, then enduring the long darkness with nothing but your thoughts, your fears, and the constant awareness that each night might be your last if the weather takes a turn for the worse. Your food situation deteriorates from merely monotonous to genuinely life-threatening as winter progresses and your carefully hoarded supplies dwindle toward dangerously low levels. The oatmeal that forms the foundation of your Highland diet becomes increasingly precious as you ration portions that were already barely adequate for maintaining your health during physically demanding outdoor work. You supplement these meager rations with whatever you can catch, trap, or scavenge from the winter landscape, the occasional rabbit, some preserved fish if you were wise enough to catch and smoke them during the summer, and various plants and roots that remain edible despite the freezing conditions. Your sheep, despite their thick Highland wool coats, struggle against winter conditions that test the limits of their remarkable adaptations to harsh climates. Finding adequate shelter for several hundred animals becomes a logistical nightmare that requires identifying natural windbreaks, constructing temporary barriers from available materials, and constantly moving your flock to areas that offer the best combination of protection and accessible grazing. Some animals inevitably succumb to the cold, and discovering their frozen corpses scattered across the winter landscape becomes a grim routine that reminds you daily of your own mortality. The psychological challenges of Highland winter create mental health problems that would overwhelm modern therapeutic approaches. The combination of social isolation, physical hardship, limited daylight, and constant survival pressure creates conditions that test the sanity of even the most mentally resilient individuals. You develop coping strategies that range from elaborate daily routines designed to maintain psychological structure to conversations with imaginary companions who help fill the crushing silence of winter nights that seem to stretch toward infinity. Historians still argue whether Highland shepherds experienced higher mortality rates during winter months, or whether their adaptation to harsh conditions actually improved their survival chances compared to people living in more populated areas. But contemporary accounts suggest that winter deaths were common enough to be expected rather than surprising. Some shepherds simply disappeared during winter months, their bodies discovered months later when spring thaws revealed the locations where they'd succumbed to cold hunger or accidents that occurred during desperate attempts to maintain their flocks. Your Bothie becomes both sanctuary and prison during the worst winter weather, providing essential protection against wind and precipitation, but also confining you to a space barely large enough for basic survival activities. The turf roof, which provides adequate insulation during milder weather struggles against the thermal demands of Highland winter, requiring constant maintenance and repair as freeze-thaw cycles damage the structure and winter storms tear away sections that you must replace using whatever materials you can scavenge from the frozen landscape. The maintenance of your fire becomes literally a matter of life and death because losing your heat source during a Highland winter storm could result in freezing to death within hours. Your fuel supplies, primarily peat, that you've cut and dried during summer months, must be carefully rationed to last through the entire winter season, creating constant anxiety about whether you've stored enough fuel to survive until spring. Finding additional fuel during winter requires venturing out in dangerous conditions to search for fallen branches, dried vegetation, or additional peat deposits that haven't been claimed by other desperate people. Your water sources present daily challenges that would test the ingenuity of survival experts because Highland streams and springs can freeze solid during the coldest periods, forcing you to melt snow or ice for drinking water and basic hygiene needs. This process consumes precious fuel and time while providing water that lacks the mineral content and taste of fresh spring water. Some shepherds develop techniques for locating underground springs that remain liquid throughout winter, but accessing these sources often requires dangerous travel across icy terrain. The arrival of spring in the Highland landscape represents one of nature's most dramatic transformations, as the seemingly dead winter world suddenly explodes into life with an intensity that makes you understand why ancient peoples worshipped seasonal deities. The first signs of warming weather, longer daylight hours, the sound of melting snow, the appearance of early wildflowers create emotional responses that border on religious ecstasy after months of survival-focused existence. Your sheep, weakened by winter hardships, but somehow still alive, begin to show renewed energy as fresh grass appears and grazing conditions improve dramatically. The psychological relief of surviving another Highland winter creates a euphoric sense of accomplishment that temporarily makes all the hardships seem worthwhile. You've successfully maintained your flock through conditions that eliminate the weak, the unlucky, and the poorly prepared, proving your competence as a Highland shepherd and earning the right to face another year of challenges that will test your skills, your endurance, and your determination to continue this impossible but somehow essential way of life. Your relationship with the Highland landscape deepens through these winter ordeals as you develop an intimate understanding of how this harsh environment operates and what it demands from those who choose to live within its boundaries. The mountains, valleys, and weather patterns that seemed hostile and unpredictable during your first seasons become familiar adversaries that you've learned to read, respect, and occasionally outwit through hard-won experience and carefully developed survival skills. The cycle begins again as spring progresses towards summer, bringing new challenges, but also renewed hope that this year might be easier, more profitable, or simply more survivable than the previous year's struggles against Highland weather, Highland politics, and the eternal challenge of keeping hundreds of independent-minded sheep alive in one of Europe's most unforgiving environments. The seasons turn again, and you watch spring's gentle return to the Highland landscape with eyes that have seen too many harsh winters and survived too many impossible situations. The heather begins to bloom across the hillsides in shades of purple that seem almost impossibly beautiful after months of gray and white monotony. Your sheep, the survivors of another Highland winter, spread across the warming pastures with renewed energy, and for a brief moment the endless cycle of challenges and hardships seems almost worthwhile. The mist rises from the valleys in soft, welcoming tendrils that speak of gentler weather ahead, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the call of returning birds who've spent the winter in warmer, kinder places. Your Bothie, which served as both shelter and prison during the dark months, now feels less like a survival necessity and more like a simple home where a Highland shepherd can rest between the seasons of his impossible essential work. The ancient rhythms of Highland life continue as they have for centuries, and tomorrow will bring new challenges, new weather, new struggles, with stubborn sheep and hostile terrain. But tonight, as the Highland darkness settles gently over mountains that have witnessed countless generations of shepherds facing the same eternal challenges, you can rest, knowing that you've earned your place in this harsh, beautiful, unforgiving landscape that somehow, against all reason, has become your home. Sleep well, Highland shepherd. The mountains will still be there in the morning, and your sheep will still need your care. But for now, let the soft Highland wind carry you toward dreams of warmer seasons and easier times that may or may not ever come.